Brain Banter is a podcast about the goings-on of Columbia University neuroscience professors and the stories behind who they are, how they got to where they are, and the motivations and explanations behind their research. My name is Lila Bear, and I'm your host. Do you think you're a rational decision maker? Well, think again. On the show today is Dr. Michael Woodford, macroeconomist, monetary theorist, and political economy professor at Columbia University. Today, we delve into the links between economic decision-making and neuroscience. Let's jump in. There's a lot that we need to cover because you've done a lot. So I kind of want to start at the beginning. You started off at UChicago, and then you made your way to Yale and MIT, but let's start off with UChicago. So what did you study when you were there?
Well, a lot of things. I started out in physics, but got more interested in the social sciences and ended up wanting to do a cognitive science type of program, which didn't exist. So it was essentially a self-created major that I ended up having to put together.
Okay. And then how did you segue? I think you started off at law school and then made a change
there, which is one of the problems with not having a traditional major. Was I was very interested in it, and I hadn't thought a lot about what you do with it next. And I ended up thinking, well, people who weren't at all specialized were good for law school. This was 1970s. A lot of my classmates were doing the same thing, and so anyway, I went to law school where it turned out that the analytical part of studying the law, again, at least then in the late 1970s, seemed to be economics. All of my classes, the analytical part of the class was economics. And so I decided I needed to understand economics better. And so that's how I decided I needed to get a PhD in economics. And that's what I went into. And in economics, the field I ended up specializing in was macroeconomics. And a lot of people, I guess, find that puzzling because of the work I do in cognitive science now. And they say, well, that seems very far from the level of the individual decision maker to think about the economy as a whole instead of focusing on things that are closer to the individual. And the answer is because at least when I was in school, and maybe this was my misperception of the field, but at least the way it seemed then, and so this is back at the beginning of the 1980s, it seemed that the study of microeconomics and decisions of individual firms and individual households was treated, at least by economists, as something where it was obvious what people did. And the theory of decision-making involved was completely obvious and cut and dried, whereas macroeconomics was an area where subjectivity obviously mattered because the fundamental decisions that one was interested in had to do with things that were not right in front of people. So you had to make decisions about whether to invest or not, whether to save or not, that had to do with the future. Had to do with thinking about a state of affairs which wasn't right in front of you. And so modeling decisions as simply being based on evidence that was just obviously there and uncontroversial really couldn't be done. You had to think about the subjective element of how people construe the world that they're in order to understand what happens. And that was actually why I went into macroeconomics as the thing that I thought was the most interesting. That it was a way of pursuing interests I had in thinking about, the bases for knowledge and issues of that kind. And eventually, I've come back to working more on topics close to cognitive science and thinking a lot about the foundations of decision making. As in fact, something that my work in macroeconomics forced me to realize was important, that I eventually concluded that the field, to approach the problems that economists wanted to understand, that understanding the foundations of how people's minds work was really going to be important, and that economists needed to go more into that. And so that's a focus of a lot of what I work on and what I teach these days.
So would you say that your field is neuroeconomics? Is that a term?
That's a term that that people use, and that I identify with that community, with the people who do neuroeconomics. It's not especially my favorite word,
Okay.
but I know a lot of people, I think, who would consider themselves neuroeconomists, and I think we have shared interests and aims. The reason I'm not in love with the word, I'm very interested in learning from neuroscience, and I do a lot of work with people whose training is in neuroscience. I have many collaborators who have been trained as neuroscientists. But the thing that I'm interested in isn't so much understanding specifically how the neural circuitry gets decisions made as an end in itself. Whereas at least some people in neuroeconomics, I think, would say, well, the point of neuroeconomics is to understand what is the biological substrate through which economic decisions get made, essentially as a branch of neuroscience, as something closely related to what some people would call decision neuroscience, as a branch of neuroscience. And I'm very interested in understanding more about decision neuroscience, but I'm not a neuroscientist, and I wouldn't say the main aim of my own work is to answer questions about how the brain does it as a goal in itself. What I want to understand better is to better understand what kind of decisions are made. But I believe very much that it's been a positive thing for economists to talk more to neuroscientists in terms of making progress on having a deeper understanding of how decisions are made. And I think it'll ultimately lead to better models of the things that economists care about, which is not how it happens really in the brain, but what people do. What are the decisions that are made, and how do decisions change when you change the environment that someone is making a decision in. And I think that, so I think there's the interplay between economics and neuroscience has been very productive, and I'm very interested in it. And so I've been trying to learn some neuroscience in order to pursue that kind of research. But again, the reason I'm not extremely comfortable with the neuroeconomics term is that some people would think that means you're specifically doing neuroscience, although it's the neuroscience maybe of economic decisions. And I would say I'm interested in cognitive modeling. And I think there's a lot to learn from the neuroscience literature to have better models of cognitive processes. And there are various reasons why I think it's important to in fact learn from the neuroscience literature. One is just that it's introduced a lot of additional kinds of measurements and sources of information to discipline modeling of cognitive processes. So cognitive psychology existed for quite a while before it was having a lot of contact with neuroscience. But the way you had to get ideas about how to model the cognitive processes was strictly from observing the human behavior. You would observe the behavior. You might collect a lot of statistics on what was done, how often in the case of a particular kind of problem, but then you had to conjecture cognitive processes, basically from observing things at the level of the behavior. If you can take physiological measurements at the same time, that can give you a lot of additional information to cross-check your models of underlying cognitive behavior. And I think that has, in fact, been very valuable, is very valuable even to someone who has, again, my own personal interest is not particularly in understanding why can the brain do it, as a thing of interest in itself. I just want to know, about the cognitive processes and what decisions people make, and But I think that having this additional information about what's happening in the nervous system when people are presented with information and when they make decisions can, in fact, lead to better models. And I am interested in that, in having the better models.
For sure. We want the best research we can get. So in your lab, what specific decisions are you focusing on?
So often they're pretty basic ones. Sometimes they're more complicated, but my belief has been that they're very basic issues that we need to learn how to model better, and that one is more likely to be able to figure out what's really going on by presenting people with quite simple decisions, but then documenting very carefully exactly how what they do changes as you change a few parameters of the situation they're in. So that means I've done a lot of work, experimental work that presents people with extremely simple decisions, like choosing between a lottery and a certain amount of money, or choosing between two lotteries that are different payoffs and different probabilities, and just asking, which would you want if given a choice between these two things. Or they might involve simple decisions between different amounts of money relatively soon versus some amount of money with a time delay of a few weeks, and changing the amount of the time delay, changing the amount of the early money as opposed to the amount of money you can get later. And so you have a few parameters to change and see how people's choices vary. So some of the things I've worked on involve more complicated problems than those ones. But the kind of things that I want to study in general are problems that try to make the decision problem simple, so it only depends on a few things. Although I think it is also important that it does depend on more than one piece of information, because I think the thing I'm interested in is understanding how different pieces of information get combined to then make a judgment about how valuable something is in order to make a decision. So in other words, if you just ask people, would you like to get $10 or $8? That's too simple. You're not going to find interesting things about variations in people's behavior. If you make them decide really fast, maybe you can get them to make some mistakes, but that's too simple. You need to have a problem where there are at least a couple of different numerical quantities that are both relevant to deciding how valuable the thing is. And they have to, maybe one of them makes the choice look better, but the other one makes the choice look worse. And they have to figure out how to combine those two things to decide overall whether that's the better choice or not. Then it becomes non-trivial. And the question of how in the brain information is combined to make judgments of value now becomes an issue that's not completely trivial. But at the same time, if you present people with real decisions, the kind of decisions that people mostly have to deal with in their life, there are just so many elements that having clear experimental control of what the problem is, what the information is that people are presented with, what the elements of their decision are, then becomes hard. And so I spend a lot of time on things where it's, perhaps artificially an extremely simple kind of decision, but nonetheless not completely trivial, not so trivial that you don't find interesting biases and you don't find variability in the answer that even the same person will give when presented with that same problem on more than one occasion, because in fact it's not trivial for people to know exactly what they want when you describe an option that where more than one numerical quantity matters for determining the value of the thing to them.
Right. So, okay, let's go back to the most basic example, the lottery example. Well, what's like the most basic thing you've discovered on that level of decision making?
Well, so one thing that I'm interested in, and I think is non-trivial for economics, although it's a very basic thing that one observes experimentally about this kind of decision making, is just that people don't make the same choice when you present them with exactly the same problem described exactly the same way more than one time. So you might think that's so banal as to not even be interesting.
Yeah.
But the traditional approach to thinking about decision-making in economics is to assume that people have they're so-called rational decision makers, which means that they have some well-defined idea of what they like better than anything else. So all the different possible outcomes from them, from making different choices, they should be able to order them perfectly. There should be a complete ordering of all the different possible outcomes for you, and you should know what you rank ahead of what else. And since it's just about what you like, you should have perfect knowledge of this. You shouldn't have any trouble knowing which of the things you like better than which other things. And presented with a choice, you should be able to just order those different things you're being presented with on this ordering and reliably and predictably pick the thing that you rank higher. And so what economists assume is more complicated, of course, about these kinds of things is, well, figuring out what people like. You might not know for a given person what they like better. And so you would have to present them with many different choices or observe them making many decisions to start trying to work out how that particular person orders different things. But it's often, typically, it's assumed controversial that, of course, there must exist some coherent ordering and that satisfies certain logical properties, like the person who prefers A to B and prefers B to C, therefore that same person must prefer A to C, and so on. And it's assumed that, of course, there exists a set of preferences that have these properties. And so it's interesting, I think, to demonstrate that, well, if you present, even as I said, with relatively simple choices, you present someone with a choice and you completely describe to them the relevant information about what they would get from making the choice, that it's in fact not the case that the same person presented with exactly the same choice problem, the same set of choices described exactly the same way, necessarily makes exactly the same choice when asked about it repeatedly. And of course, when I say they don't do the same thing, it doesn't mean there's nothing predictable about what they do. You can, by observing the choice made several times, you can learn about the probability of a given person picking one thing or the other, and you find that there's a lot of systematic patterns in how those probabilities of choice vary with the numerical description of the options that you're giving them. And so it's not that they just do something that has nothing to do with the information you told them, but they're using that information in a way that doesn't produce this reliable deterministic choice. It's something that needs to be modeled as a stochastic process. And you want to understand what's that stochastic, I want at least to understand what that stochastic process is like that will predict the probability of their choosing one thing or another, as, say, you vary the terms of the gamble, as in the way you describe it to them. Okay. So that's one thing. But I mean, there are more interesting kinds of departures from predictions of rational choice theory. But I mean, that'd be an example of the kind of thing that I want to study in detail.
Right. Okay. So this is called rational choice theory, and the thing that just came to my mind. So let's say I need some shampoo and conditioner. I just got back to New York and I go to Walgreens and there are all the different options. And I go in the morning and I choose Neutrogena, and then I go in the afternoon and maybe I choose Herbal Essence. Is that the kind of decision you're looking at? And why would I have chosen something different? Like, is that a generalized answer, or is that very individual?
Well, so I mean, if you're asking, which shampoo does someone buy, there's certainly important individual elements in it, right? I mean, we know everybody doesn't buy the same kind of shampoo, and that's also not a problem for economic theory that they don't. But what I think there is good evidence of is to suggest that a lot of decisions are made on the basis of only a sort of fuzzy degree of awareness of exactly what the properties of the options are. And so the idea that, when you went to the store, you made the choice you made because you were perfectly aware of everything that was there on the shelf. You knew what all the options were, you knew what their properties were, and you picked the Neutrogena. You picked it because it's the thing you rank highest. You understand exactly how you rank all those things, and you say, well, then that's the one I rank highest. That's my favorite of the set. Of course, I take the one I like the best. What would you expect? Of course, I take the one I like the best, but I know exactly how I rank all of them relative to each other. My guess is probably not. It may not be that you've ever thought about how you rank each of the things just because it's on the shelf, that you would be able to tell me whether you like each of them better than each of the other ones and exactly by how much. That I think that we are able to operate and operate pretty well in our lives without having thought through, what our complete orderings are of all the possible things you could have in life. And so understanding what the process is like that operates in this more imprecise way, I think matters. Now, if you ask, so does it matter that people operate in kind of an imprecise way, rather than in a perfectly precise way? The answer is, well, sometimes it does, because their decisions end up depending on things that you might think they shouldn't depend on, exactly because of the mental shortcuts that are involved in making a decision in an imprecise way without having to be perfectly aware of all the information that's out there.
So by mental shortcuts, can you clarify?
Well, so one kind of observation that doesn't make sense from the point of view of standard rational choice theory is that if you put another option there on the shelf with the things that the person is comparing, that can change the likelihood that the consumer will buy one of the originally available brands, even if they don't buy the new thing.
Right.
So standard rational choice theory would say, you should know what you want, you should know how you rank these things. Whether you rank Neutrogena higher than some other brand or not. Okay, you do or you don't, whatever it is, you should know how you rank them. And if I put some other new kind of shampoo on the shelf there, maybe you go for it, right? Maybe you're curious, you like the bottle or whatever you like about it. But if you don't go for the new thing, then it shouldn't change the relative ranking of the two things that were there before, right? And if you wouldn't have picked the other one, you would have picked the Neutrogena. The fact that I put this new thing on the shelf shouldn't change that. You shouldn't go now for the thing that you didn't pick the other time, right? If you're a rational decision maker. But what you can observe, and of course marketers like to play tricks of this kind, they observe that they can introduce another product and make something more attractive that was there before. So the classic kind of example of this is you want to get people to buy a more expensive option, which has some better features. And, some people would go for it. Some people don't, though, because, it has some better features, but it's definitely more expensive. And that by putting another option, making another option available, which is even more expensive than the expensive one, and not so much greater, maybe not obviously greater at all, but definitely more expensive, you can make the expensive option of the previously available options more attractive to people. More people go for it, right? But this is contrary to that theory that I said, that people should have, they should know how they rank things. How they rank things should just depend on what they get. So the characteristics of the thing that they would go home with, that should determine, how they rank buying that as opposed to buying the other thing. And introducing this third option, shouldn't change the relative ranking of those other two things for them, because it doesn't change any of the characteristics of what you get if you go home with one of the things or the other thing. And yet it seems that you can affect people's purchases in a way that violates the properties of rational choice theory. And of course, this is certainly interesting to marketers. They can make money off of doing this, but it also, I think, affects. It should affect one's views of the extent to which, say, markets need to be regulated. Do you take it for granted that people know what they're doing when they're in the marketplace, and so they'll take care of themselves? If they buy something, it means it's the thing that's best for them, because they wouldn't buy it if it wasn't, supplying them with more of what they want. If you think that people can be tricked and do make certain kinds of systematic mistakes, you might think that that's a case for regulating more what kind of things it should be possible to expose people to. So I think it does matter for pretty fundamental things about your view of how markets work, if you think that the judgments that people make can be affected by contextual factors. Now, if you ask, so, how can we understand things like that? It's interesting that people make similar kinds of puzzling judgments about purely perceptual questions. You can ask them about, which is bigger of two geometric shapes, and find that depending, you add another geometric shape to the set, ask which of them is bigger, that adding another shape can affect the likelihood that they'll say they think one of those first two shapes was bigger than the other, which tells you something about vision, okay? But it tells you that the process through which one makes, say, perceptual judgments about just relative sizes of things or comparisons of other perceptual magnitudes, in fact, does seem very often to be context dependent. It depends on other things that are presented to the brain at the same time, has systematic effects on these judgments. And so I think there's something to learn there about relatively basic processes, relatively basic aspects of the way the brain processes information about the world that applies in many domains, not just to things connected with economic value, but that may also be relevant to the way the brain makes judgments about economic value. Now, if that's true, that means there's a lot to learn from neuroscience, because when you start talking about things like vision, now you're talking about something where, we can observe what people say about how things look, but we also can learn a lot about what's happening in the retina, in the optic nerve, in the early stages of visual processing, in later stages of visual processing, right? We know a lot about the visual system in terms of what's happening at the cellular level, what different regions of visual cortex do, and how projections from one region to the next region are involved in the process, and so on. This is something where suddenly there's a lot of evidence on how the processing is occurring that you can bring to bear on discussions of, making up a theory about what's going on. And again, in, of course, the study of vision, before people ever did anything using neuroscience, I mean, there were, of course, very active study of visual illusions. Lots of people wrote about visual illusions. They tried to study them systematically. They proposed theories. Gestalt psychology had interesting theories about how the context could distort, your perception of a given image, and so on. That were simply based off looking about the behavior, what people report. You show someone something, you ask them what they think they see, and you write down what they say, and you systematically try to come up with theories about what's going on from that. But in the last 50 years and more, we've learned a lot about visual processing from looking more into the nervous system and doing a lot of careful measurement of what's happening at the cellular level, so that now we can build more sophisticated theories of how visual illusions come about, knowing more about the nature of what happens in the nervous system when you present someone with a visual image, and then understanding how the imprecision in that processing can lead to algorithms being used that are actually pretty effective on average for making sense of the world, but that have as a byproduct systematic biases of certain kinds. And so I think in the case of vision, one is, getting to the point where we understand a lot about what happens, including, why there's variability in judgments on a given occasion, from one occasion to another, but also why there's systematic biases of various kinds, which then I think that's what I want to be able to transfer to understanding economic decision making. Because I think that similar issues, in fact, arise with making economic decisions, and I think that economists can learn a lot from understanding, understanding what we know about visual illusions as a basis for making better guesses about what kinds of errors occur in economic judgments. And certainly in the case of vision, neuroscience contributes a lot to making the theory better. To some extent, brain measurements and other physiological measurements like, use of eye tracking, for example, while people are making economic decisions, can contribute additional measurements that provide direct insight into what the cognitive processing may be like. Also, in the case of economic decisions.
So, do you think that you have been able to apply your research into your everyday life? And do you think that the decisions you make maybe are better informed by your research or more thought out?
So it certainly leads me to think more and probably to think differently about decisions. I think, it makes me more aware of the extent to which what one is doing is imperfect. I think that we often have the illusion that we're completely on top of what we're doing. And this is something that, again, we know about vision. If you ask about vision, which we know a lot more about than about economic decision making, we know that in the case of vision, people tend to think that they just see the world and they think they see it pretty well, right? And you can prove, that right now, whatever you're looking at, the other stuff in the room, you don't have that good of vision of, right? There's sort of, wherever you're focusing your eye, you have more acuity of your awareness of what's going on there. And there's lots of stuff in the room that you really, really blurry, except it doesn't look right. You're not aware of it being blurry, right? You think you see the room that you're in. You probably think you see it well, because if I ask you about any specific thing, you could turn and look at it and say, yeah, I can see that. Come on, what do you mean I can't see it? As long as you try to see some particular thing, you can see it while you're looking at it. And you don't realize that you're not, in fact, seeing it all well, except when you're really looking at it. But anyway, I think that this is probably true with economic decision making, is that people don't naturally realize how poor their awareness of what they're doing is. One of the things that I become more conscious of, as a result of doing this kind of research, is sort of realizing how prone to erratic decisions one probably is. And so I'm probably more careful, as a result of studying these things.
Yeah, I guess we all are I'm a very erratic decision maker, but I guess it's like subtly informed by, all the things that we think we see and the things right in front of us. Back to the whole shampoo example, marketing and other factors are so intertwined in our decisions. Like maybe the fact that I looked in value Neutrogena is just because of the ads on Instagram. What do you think is impacting decision making the most? Is it like what you see around you, the visual system, things around you? What do you think?
Well, I think, for example, you mentioned advertising, right? I think it's fairly obvious that has big effects, right? Certainly the companies believe it does because they spend a lot of money on it, right? They spend a lot of money to place the ads, and they pay people well to, work on improving the ads. And, they give lots of, they spend a lot and employ a lot of people to think hard about how to influence people more.
Right.
their ads. This is something that, economics has tended to have trouble thinking about and taking into account, because again, as I said, the traditional view of markets is to assume that, well, of course, people see what is there and they know what they want, that people choose things because they like them better and they know perfectly well what they like. And it's a feature, it's a function of what the features are that the thing really gives them. And so this, it's a very obvious fact about economic life that, lots of people make good money working in advertising, and the rest of us are all certainly surrounded by them. We're aware that they exist because the ads are there, and so this is a big fact of life about how the economy works. But economists don't know that much about how to think about it, how to take it into account in their models and in their view of what the market is achieving, and the extent to which the markets are making people happier or unhappier. Because there tends to be an argument. People think that organizing markets has to make people happier, has to make them better off, because they would only buy stuff at all if what they get is something they like better than what they give up to get it. And so letting them trade with other people has to make everybody, prefer what they're getting, or they wouldn't bother trading. And I think, there are interesting questions about whether people really end up happier or not when you just let whatever happened in the market will happen.
So if you could give one piece of advice to neuroscience students, economic students, pretty much just generally, what would be some neuroscientific, cognitive, econ advice? Just any of those realms.
Well, I guess I would say, think more about how you're being influenced. Because this has always been an issue, but I think the way the world is developing, people are
being pushed and pulled,
developing more and more ways, right, to try to manipulate our attention and manipulate our choices in ways that didn't happen 50 years ago. Just the technology is getting better at it, right, and the ways to get our attention are getting every year, getting better. And to function very well in the world now, I think you have to be aware of this. I think you have to try to become aware of all the things that are trying to manipulate your attention, and try to try to see it happening. Pay attention to what's being to the way people are trying to grab your attention, and ask how are they trying to influence me? What are they up to? Is this influencing me? Am I sure I want it to influence me the way it's influencing me? But try to be more conscious of.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think it's hard to sometimes even know that you're being influenced at all. I think that's the hardest
part. Right. But the point is you have to at least learn to look for it, right? Because if you're not aware that it can happen, if you don't even think of it as an issue, I think it's very natural for us to assume that we're not, because it was the same thing I said about vision. We assume that we see the world as it is, right? I mean, we think it's just there, and we think we know what we're doing. We assume we're doing the things we're doing because they're what we intended to do, they're what we want to do, and why not? I mean, right? That's sort of, if you're not at all reflective about it, it's very natural to just assume that you know what you're doing, what you're getting from the world, what the world is. And it takes education to become more conscious of of what's really going on.
I agree. Okay, well, everyone who's listening, watch out. And just to wrap up, I have some quick rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So what are you reading right now?
I'm reading a book by David Graeber, and I forget his co-author's name, Wen Chao, called The Beginning of Everything. It's about the history of humanity and challenging some conventional views about the evolution of society. Pretty interesting book. It has a big panorama of human society over tens of thousands of years, but it's a lot of fun, very exciting.
That kind of reminds me, I'm reading a book. It's called Hunter and Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. Sounds similar. I recommend it. Okay, so next question. If you could buy one thing right now, have it come to your hand right now, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not that big a consumer, so I'm
And The Economist is not very big. Okay, that's fair. And then final question, New York or Chicago?
well, I have lived in both places. I chose to go to New York. I guess who knows why I did it, but I believe that I did it because I really love New York. I've lived in. There are great things about both places. I've lived a couple of different times in my life. I lived in Chicago. I was a student there, but I went back as a faculty member and lived there another 9 years. So I know Chicago fairly well too, but I really love New York. I don't think there's anything that's a substitute. So
I wholeheartedly agree. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking to me today. I learned a lot, and I'm looking around, like thinking about why did I get this? I don't know. So it's definitely going to be on my mind for a while.
Right.
All
Good
right.
talking.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Brain Banter. Make sure to follow us on social media. Our Instagram is @GrayMattersCU. If you want to request a neuroscience professor for me to interview, you can do so at our website, which is graymattersjournalcu.org. This episode was produced and edited by me, Lila Bear. Research was done by Melody Fang and Anna Sophia Rico Rosso. Graphic design was also done by Melody Fang. Our production staff includes Sam Hutchinson and Mariana Mosin. You've been listening to Brain Banter by Gray Matters Columbia University. See you guys next week.